In this video, we're going to talk about the more practical aspects of the 4 rules. Structure every activity, clearly connect every customer supplier, specify and simplify every flow, and improve through experiments. Those are our 4 rules. So we're going to talk about how you actually use this in day-to-day life, how you put this into practice. So to start, as you think about this as a lens and a language, the fundamental objective is to ingrain it into how you think, how you see the world, how you see work, right? And so if you internalize this lens, you go to a restaurant and you see activities, connections, and flows, and you can see that a particular activity is not structured, or a connection isn't clearly connected, or that someone isn't clear about who their customer or supplier is. You see it all the time. But to develop that lens, you really need practice. You really need opportunities to do that. So here's a few ways to think about how we integrate the lens of the 4 rules into our work of improvement as we talk about activities, connections, flows, and experiments. So first, just imagine that your organization does waste walks, right? It was certainly something that many lean organizations do. They go on waste walks, whether they be virtual waste walks of a knowledge work process or physical waste walks of an operation or a physical process. So, as you're doing that, you start to say, well, you've observed some waste, right? But when you observe waste, what you really saw was the outcome, right? The effect. It's not the cause. The waste is simply a problem statement that you can now go and solve. So you might see the waste of transportation and see that what is really behind it is a lean rule was violated. Well, what lean rule was violated? Well, what's the cause? Maybe a poorly designed flow. And so we have to improve the flow in order to drive out the waste of transportation. Or we might observe the waste of motion. And we start to see that in observing where that waste of motion is, it's an unstructured activity or a poorly structured activity that produces that waste. Or you might see a delay in terms of the form of the waste of waiting. Right? And the reason is that there's a bad handoff or connection. And so that connection is poorly designed. You improve the design of the connection and the waste of waiting goes away. So the point is that when you observe waste, that's the outcome, right? That's the bad outcome that you want. That's the effect. It's the design of the work that's producing that outcome, producing that waste. And we use the lean rules to start to get after it. We also might think about problem solving, right? How do we integrate understanding the 4 rules, understanding activities, connections, and flows into problem solving? Well, for starters, we start to look at current reality, right? We start to understand the activities, the connections, the flows in our work, right? We might use observation to do that. We might do other things we'll talk about here in a second, but I dig into the work and I might use the 5 whys and start to dig and dig and dig, and ultimately I get to an activity, connection, or flow that violates the rule. And so now I start to see, well, I have a bad flow, I have a broken connection. That's my current reality, right? Now I use the 4 rules to also look at my target condition, right? How do I take a flow that wasn't simple, right? It was something like this, and how do I start to streamline it so that I get a simpler, more specific flow? Now, when you really start to ingrain the 4 rules in your organization, what you'll also find is that the 4 rules start to be a problem statement, because our standard is that every activity is structured. So you have a gap, and the gap is that the target state is a structured activity, and currently it's unstructured. There's your gap. That's the problem statement, and now you go and pursue closing that gap. And so rather than wait for a problem to exist in terms of results, we have things that aren't to the organization standard, and those become problems in their own right. Now, you also might look at, how you do process mapping in your organization. So process mapping is just a tool. It's our ability to interpret it, to understand it, to analyze it, to find opportunities to improve. So you might say, oh, here's our connections, right? I might see these connections in my work, and then I can start to look at, why is there a big delay there? Well, we have an opportunity to improve that connection. Why does this activity take so long? Well, it's because we have a whole lot of steps in here, and maybe some of those steps aren't needed. And we can start to simplify it and then structure that activity. So when you do process mapping, it's not just about putting Post-its on a wall, it's about understanding what you're mapping, understanding where are the opportunities to improve. And the activities, the connections, and the flows start to be a common lens and language to have good understanding and conversations about how to improve. And last, and perhaps most important, is just draw a picture of what you see. So you might start with someone's individual work, and they have to connect to go get some materials, and that's a connection. They might have a connection to the tools that they need, right? I don't care what the tool is, but they need some tools. They have a connection there. They might have a connection to some information that they need. They might have connection to some help that is provided. And so you start to observe, and through your observation, you start to draw a picture of what you see. And the reason this is so valuable is that when we simply use words and we start writing out answers, those answers tend to be about the results. We tell stories, we talk about outcomes, and so our words are really suited for results. But pictures are really suited for how systems work. And so if you just start trying to draw a picture of the system that you see, of the work that you see, it's much more likely that you are drawing a picture of activities, connections, and flows. So these are a few practical things that you can use to apply the lens and language, the framework of structure every activity, clearly connect every customer supplier, specify and simplify every flow, and improve through experimentation. I hope you found this useful, and remember, practice is how we develop and internalize that lens and language.